I knew something was wrong the moment the faucet sputtered out a gust of stale air instead of the water I'd been expecting. It made a sound like a disgruntled goose, a single pathetic honk. I tried it again, twisting the knob, but only another airy gasp emerged. No water, no explanation, but a gnawing certainty seized my gut. The Homeowners Association, my personal league of tormentors, had shut off my supply. This wasn't my first run-in with the Magnolia Pines HOA. I'd gotten enough nasty grams about my garbage cans being 2 inches off the curb or my mailbox paint losing its sheen to wallpaper my entire living room. But messing with my water crossed the line. I was still wearing sweat from yesterday's yard work, and now there was no relief to be found in a hot shower. I marched out front, fists clenched, scanning the quiet suburban street. White picket fences, 2-car garages, immaculate lawns that looked like they'd been sculpted one blade at a time. I caught sight of Greg Thompson, my neighbor. He was one of the few folks around here who had never joined the HOA, the last free spirit on the block aside from me. Greg was hosing off his porch. At least he had water. "Looks like your spigot's working fine," I called, my voice rasping with dusty dryness. Greg glanced at me, brow pinched with concern. "Come to think of it, yeah, everything's normal here. Problems? Oh, just the usual Magnolia Pines charm." I tried to keep my voice steady, but there was a tremor in it. If they thought I was going to be bullied into compliance with their arbitrary rules, they had another thing coming. "Have you heard anything? Rumors going around about them punishing a homeowner by cutting off water." He grimaced. "Not a word. But maybe they're trying to make an example out of you. You did file that complaint, right? The one about the rising HOA fees." I exhaled sharply. Indeed, about 3 weeks ago, I'd submitted a formal protest letter to the HOA board. They'd raised the neighborhood fees again, claiming it was for community improvements, which evidently meant half-dead pansies placed at the entrance gate. Meanwhile, our roads were riddled with potholes, and apparently, they had enough money to threaten me with citations for leaving a rake in my yard overnight. I did. "But this is a new low, even for them," I said, spitting dust from my lips as if that would rinse away the bitterness. "I'm calling the water utility to confirm they didn't shut it off for some oversight." I fished my phone out, stepping away from Greg, and dialed the utility company. After the usual automated loops, I finally got an agent on the line. She confirmed that my account was current, no reported service issues in my area. She even apologized for the inconvenience. So it had to be the HOA. By the time I hung up, the sweat caking my arms and forehead had started to itch. I glanced across the street at the pristine Magnolia Pines golf course, which was ironically part of the HOA's prized amenities. Perfect emerald grass shimmering in the late morning sun, the sprinklers gracefully arcing water across the 18th hole. It was a downright mocking sight, like the water they denied me was all being pumped onto those manicured fairways. I grabbed a half-empty bottle from my car and slumped onto my porch swing, guzzling what little water I had left. My eyes strayed to the thick swath of trees behind our houses. A winding, shallow river cut through that small patch of forest. A natural boundary that had existed long before Magnolia Pines was even a scribble on an architect's blueprint. It glimmered from time to time on sunny days, just enough to catch my eye, though it was overshadowed by the meticulously maintained golf course on the other side. In that moment of frustration, a wild thought bubbled up in the back of my mind. If they refused me water from the tap, maybe I'd just help myself from the river. Heck, the river was here before the HOA. Who's to say I can't harness it somehow? I tried to smother that idea. It was ridiculous, petty, and probably illegal. But every time I looked over at that lush green golf course, soaking up precious water, an ember of rebellion glowed hotter in my chest. I wasn't one to pick a fight, but if the fight came to my doorstep, especially in the form of no running water, then I would meet it head on. Greg gave me a casual wave and headed inside. I'd half expected him to come over and lecture me on how to handle the situation calmly or file another complaint. But I'd done everything by the book already. The HOA obviously didn't care. There was a scratchy dryness in my mouth, a dryness that seemed to echo the new emptiness beneath my sink. I was tired of petty letters, tired of rising fees, tired of being singled out. Maybe I was losing my mind or letting my anger get the best of me. But as I stared at the sparkling water jets dancing over the golf course's 18th hole, the voice in the back of my head grew stronger. Divert the river. Let flood their precious green heaven. Let them taste a real inconvenience. I shook the thought away. For the moment, I had bigger problems like finding a place to shower. Still, that seed had been planted. Whether it took root or not remained to be seen. But in the quietness of that hot morning, the brand new dryness of my faucets, and the unwavering swirl of sprinklers on the golf course, I had a feeling the HOA had just lit a fire they might not be prepared to extinguish. After calling 3 neighbors to confirm their water was functioning fine, it was, of course, I wrote a polite but firm email to the HOA board demanding they reconnect my water immediately. By the time I fired off that missive, my frustration was pulsing like a toothache. I paced around my house, considering my options. The telephone rang, shattering the tense quiet. It was Rick Ellison, the HOA president, a man whose voice could curdle milk over the phone. "I received your email," he began in a measured, condescending tone. "We need to have a meeting. We can't discuss the intricacies of your violation over email." "Oh, my violation," I said, tossing a hand in the air though he couldn't see it. "Not the violation of shutting off my water." "Right, Rick?" He paused for a beat. "We didn't shut off anything, but we need to talk about your infractions and how they might affect your privileges." "Privileges? Water is not a privilege. It's a basic necessity." I tried to keep the anger from my voice, but he made it difficult. "What are these so-called infractions, anyway?" "Well, we've got records of repeated yard violations, storage of unsightly objects, ladders, paint cans, and so forth, in plain view, not to mention you're 3 weeks late for your HOA fee." "I mailed that check," I thundered. In fact, I remembered sealing the envelope while re-watching an old detective show from the 80s. If it hasn't arrived, that's on the mail system, not me. "And as for the yard violations, we both know you people define unsightly as a single dandelion or a rake that's not neatly hidden. That's not for me to decide," he said, although of course it was. The board was basically Rick and his cronies, a small group that reveled in the power of making life miserable. "We'll discuss it at the meeting. 7 p.m. tonight, the community center." He clicked off before I could reply. My chest felt tight, a swirl of fear and anger. I had that twisting in the gut that I got in high school when called to the principal's office for something I hadn't done. Only now I was in my 50s, and the principal was this smug guy with a comb-over and an inflated sense of entitlement. I spent the rest of the day rummaging for bottled water, mixing instant coffee with ice-cold water from a jug to tide me over. The thought of going to the community center made me nauseous, but I wanted to face them. If it didn't get resolved, I have to go to a lawyer or the media, something dramatic and public. Yet a trickle of that earlier notion, diverting the river, kept poking at me, tempting me. I pictured a muddy stream tearing through the neatly manicured 18th hole. It was petty, sure, but it also felt just... The hours trickled by painfully slowly. At 6:30, I changed into a clean shirt. No shower, obviously, so I did what I could with a damp cloth from a jug of water I'd been saving in the fridge. On the drive to the community center, my frustration simmered with every inch of the road. The meeting room was already half filled with impeccably groomed men and women. They wore pressed polo shirts and pastel sweaters draped over their shoulders. Country club fashion if I'd ever seen it. Rick Ellison stood at the front, flanked by 2 board members, Ms. Hensley and Mr. Gupta, who were fiddling with papers. I recognized a few other neighbors who had come in with concerns about the recent fee hike. The moment I walked in, the chatter hushed. The overhead fluorescent lights made everything feel sterile and tense. "Have a seat," Rick said, pointing to a metal folding chair in the front row. His smile was thin as dental floss. I settled into the chair, crossing my arms. "Well, let's have it." Ms. Hensley cleared her throat. "We've had multiple complaints regarding the appearance of your property. You've repeatedly neglected to store your lawn tools properly. Your trash and recycling bins are left out past the approved times, and you are overdue on your HOA fees." "My fees are paid," I interrupted. "And what do paint cans in my garage have to do with shutting off my water?" Rick gave me a patronizing raise of his eyebrows. "We have not, as an association, turned off your water. That's a service matter between you and the water company. If you're having issues, perhaps you failed to properly submit your payment to them. We have no record of involvement in that. I almost laughed. It was such a blatant lie. They probably had used some obscure clause or backdoor method to get my water shut off. This was how they operated, after all, through intimidation, confusion, and bureaucratic smokescreens. Look, I said, leaning forward. All I want is for my water to come back on. Maybe you guys think it's cute to punish me, but we're talking about basic human dignity. If there's a misunderstanding, I'm happy to fix it. But don't play games. Rick sniffed. There's a path toward reinstatement of your community privileges. I slammed my hand on the metal chair's arm. Again, water is not a community privilege. He offered a pinched smile. Well, we can't be responsible for your misunderstanding of how these matters are handled. However, the board can reauthorize the standard privileges for your address if you attend an inspection with us tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp, and address the outstanding housekeeping issues. That might help confirm your compliance with our guidelines. And if I refuse? He tilted his head back, shrugging. Then we can't do anything further, I'm afraid. You'll have to deal with the city yourself. I glanced around. Some onlookers avoided my eyes, pretending not to see the betrayal unfolding. They just wanted to hurry along, get home, have dinner, and not get on the board bad side. They all left me to hang. All right, I finally bit out. I'll be there. But this better mean my water gets turned back on. Fast. Wonderful, Ms. Hensley cooed, scribbling something in her folder. We appreciate your willingness to cooperate. Cooperate, right? I rose and stalked out of the community center, my mind spiraling with anger. They were cornering me, forcing me to jump through bureaucratic hoops to get something I should already have by law. It wasn't just water. It was about control. And if there was one thing I'd learned in my decades on this earth, it was that people like Rick Ellison thrived on making sure no one else got the upper hand. I stepped into the humid evening air, my head buzzing. Tomorrow, I'll let them poke around, maybe appease their demands. But the idea of letting them get away with this was making my stomach churn. And in that hazy brew of frustration, an outlandish plan took shape, just a flicker of possibility. They want to keep me from having water? I'll let them have more water than they can handle. It was a bold notion, a dangerous one, but in the war zone that my life had become, I wasn't entirely convinced it was off the table. I just needed to figure out how. The next morning, I woke well before dawn, cracking open one of the last bottled waters in my dwindling stash. The clang of my nerves matched the headache pounding behind my eyes. I spent a restless night flipping between resentment and regret. Maybe a younger me would have caved, paid an extra fee under the table, apologized for yard code violations I didn't commit. But I was too old to be bullied. By 7:45, I was out front, awaiting the dreaded inspection. Sure enough, a big, shiny golf cart. Yes, the HOA used them for official visits. Rumbled down my street. Rick Ellison hopped out with Ms. Hensley and Mr. Gupta in tow, all wearing stiff smiles and crisp summer attire. They had a clipboard, a camera, and enough arrogance to float a hot air balloon. "Morning," Rick said in a voice devoid of warmth. "Shall we start?" I gestured for them to do whatever it was they needed. Their eyes roamed over my porch, my grass, the trim of my house. Ms. Hensley scribbled notes on a clipboard. A single dandelion near the driveway earned me a pointed frown. They inched around to my backyard, stepping carefully over the patchy grass. The dryness of my lawn was already noticeable. It had been 2 days without a proper sprinkler system. Meanwhile, the golf course looked like a pristine emerald kingdom. They snapped photos of a couple of paint cans I'd left out by my shed, a sin so grievous Ms. Hensley actually gasped. Then they found a broken lattice panel behind the trash cans. "Maintenance is part of your HOA agreement," Rick said, tapping the board with the toe of his boat shoe. "This needs replacing, and those paint cans need to be hidden in a locked storage area. We run a tight ship here." I could feel my teeth grinding. They were nitpicking every trivial imperfection, as if my property were part of their trophy shelf. "Sure," I said, forcing a neutral tone. "I'll replace the panel." "Anything else?" Rick exhaled, glancing over to Ms. Hensley, who flipped a few pages on the clipboard. That's the main exterior stuff. Of course, if you like, we can come inside. That won't be necessary. I cut him off. Your guidelines mention exterior compliance. My interior is none of your business. He gave a tight-lipped nod. Fair enough. But we'll need a timetable for your compliance, or we can't consider your privileges reinstated. Oh, is that what you call water these days? A privilege? The sarcasm almost dripped from my lips. I'll get on this stuff right away, if my water's turned back on. Rick plastered on that condescending grin again. We'll do what we can to expedite it. Once you complete the fixes, I couldn't contain my outburst. Shut it, Rick. I'm tired of your cat and mouse game. If the water's not back on by the end of the day, we'll see about other measures. He blinked, taken aback for a moment, but recovered quickly. Threats now? That's unfortunate. We do not respond well to intimidation. I let out a bitter laugh. Ironic, isn't it? Ms. Hensley coughed, clearly uncomfortable. If you want to remain in good standing, she began, I suggest you watch your tone. We're only here to help you. I'd had enough. Without another word, I spun on my heel and marched toward my front door. Behind me, I heard Rick muttering something, but I was done. They'd gotten their inspection, their photos, their petty list of demands. Now I just had to see if they'd deliver on their side. It took exactly 1 hour before a text pinged my phone, a note from Rick. We're assessing your compliance timeline. We'll let you know about your water status soon. Assessing my compliance timeline. Right. They could keep me dangling for days or weeks if they wanted to. The rage inside me was a slow boil. Desperate, I rummaged through a dusty trunk in my garage, looking for an old set of county zoning maps I remembered stuffing away. Back in my younger days, I was curious about local water flows and property lines. Call an odd hobby, topography had always fascinated me. And I had once considered building a new koi pond, so I collected all sorts of data about drainage and watershed paths near the neighborhood. It took me half an hour of rifling through musty papers, but eventually I found a rolled-up map labeled Magnolia County Waterways. I spread it across my kitchen table, eyes devouring the faint lines of streams and rivulets. Sure enough, there it was, the winding river that ran behind our subdivision. And not far from it was the Magnolia Pines golf course, snug as could be. Their prized 18th hole lay a mere few hundred yards from the main bend of the river. As I traced the lines, a wild idea sparked in my mind. If I were to dig or shift some natural rock formations, maybe I could create a channel. The gradient wasn't huge, but if carefully engineered, water could be diverted. It wouldn't be a raging flood, but enough to cause real trouble for the course's expensive landscaping. Of course, I couldn't just waltz in with a shovel and open the floodgates. I need to be stealthy, plan the route. If the HOA insisted on illegally withholding my water, maybe I'd respond in kind by legally or quasi-legally, redirecting nature's flow onto their beloved fairways. I knew it was a big risk. Tinkering with waterways can lead to serious legal consequences. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect retaliation. They cared so much about controlling the environment, about punishing me for trivial details. Let them see what real inconvenience looked like. And if I was crafty enough, maybe it would look like an act of God. The river has a mind of its own, after all. I tapped a pencil against the map, adrenaline kicking in. This could be done in stages. Start small, see if the water can be partially diverted. If I cause a minor flood, not enough to destroy anything, but enough to disrupt their precious golfing events that might send a message, then maybe they'd stop messing with me. Looking out the window, I saw that patch of trees swaying in the breeze. The river's glint was visible through the branches. From here, it was a gorgeous scene, a piece of nature that had stubbornly remained despite suburban sprawl. But if harnessed and redirected, it could become a force. My force. This was no idle daydream. I was done playing by their rules. If they turned my water back on, maybe I could let this go. Maybe. But if I went another day without a working tap, I'd have my shovel ready. I scouted the area just before dusk, parking my truck on an overgrown side road and trekking through the brush. The ground was soft with last night's rain, a rain that had obviously done nothing for my faucets, and mosquitoes whined at my ears. Despite the discomfort, I had a new purpose fueling me. My first objective was to understand the river's current well enough to see if diverting a small channel was feasible. Beneath the canopy of tall oaks and sycamores, the water moved at a slow, steady pace, weaving around rocks and roots. Nothing too dramatic, but with the right trench or rechanneling, it could spill over a contour in the land and flow in the direction of the golf course. The 18th hole was perched close to the edge of these woods, a neat boundary of pines buffering it from the actual wild. The golf course had no fence along this part, just a line of meticulously planted decorative shrubs and a sign that read, "Private property, golfers and guests only." I crouched by the water, listening to it gurgle over smooth stones. There was something almost comforting about it, nature's gentle pulse. I made mental notes. The area with softer soil was about 30 yards upstream. That's where a small side stream could be carved out with enough labor. From there, the water would follow the path of least resistance, eventually snaking through the pines and toward the manicured green. I'd have to move quickly and probably in the cover of night, because the last thing I needed was the HOA calling the county sheriff. A part of me wondered if I was going too far. Was this childish revenge or a rightful stand against tyranny? But then I remembered the dryness of my pipes, the smug grin on Rick Ellison's face, and the silent complicity of all those in the community center. My frustration was bigger than a trivial grudge at this point. It was about principle, about not letting a pack of petty tyrants push me around. That night, I slept in fits, adrenaline zinging through my veins. I woke before sunrise, tossing a shovel and pickaxe in my truck bed. Nobody was out at that hour, and the sky was still a cool shade of steel gray. I drove to the same side road, tucked the truck into a concealed spot, and set off toward the river. My heart thudded as I surveyed the land by the soft morning light. The plan: dig a shallow trench from that soft soil bend to the slope that angled toward the golf course. With any luck, the water would find the path, and a new mini-tributary would form. I wasn't going for a raging flood, but enough to saturate the edge of the course. If I was really successful, it might wash out a swath of fairway, maybe even pool around the 18th hole. And so I began. The physical work was grueling. Every stab of the shovel was a small rebellion. My arms shook as I pried up chunks of mud and tossed them aside, forming a little channel about a foot wide. Early on, it felt like an impossible task. I'd never done anything like this. But the river's quiet encouragement and my fury at the HOA propelled me onward. After 3 hours of labor, sweat soaked my shirt and my palms were raw. The sun had risen fully, and I was panting hard. But I'd carve a path of maybe 10 yards, connecting to a natural depression in the earth. I took a moment to breathe, stepping back to watch if the water would flow. At first, nothing happened. Then a trickle found its way in. A small, gurgling stream began meandering into the channel I dug. My pulse quickened. The water inched along, following the mild slope. Within minutes, a thin rivulet was forging its way toward the golf course boundary. "Okay," I murmured. "Let's see how far you go." I wiped my brow and took a few more whacks at obstructing rocks that threatened to break the flow. It wasn't a roaring torrent, but it was something, enough to make the soil near the boundary line a muddy mess. Good. Finally, I packed up my tools and withdrew into the forest, making sure to stomp any footprints and cover my tracks. By the time I reached my truck, I could hear the distant hum of lawnmowers, likely the grounds crew at Magnolia Pines. They had no idea what was coming their way. I spent the rest of the day anxiously pacing my living room, rechecking my phone in case I got any calls from the HOA. None came. I still had no water for my taps, so I was forced to hop over to a nearby gym just to use their showers. The entire time, I kept envisioning a muddy surge creeping onto the 18th hole. When evening arrived, I decided to take a covert drive near the golf course. I parked in a visitor's lot off to the side and strolled onto the green. I wasn't a golfer, but sometimes they let community residents walk the edges as long as they weren't disruptive. I kept my hands in my pockets, head low, trying to project the aura of someone who belonged there. Around the corner from the 17th hole, I glimpsed a couple of staff members kneeling in the grass, their expressions grim. Mud had spread in a watery half circle around the edge of the green, forming an impromptu swamp. The small decorative shrubs along the boundary were partially uprooted, their root balls jutting out in weird angles. It was clear the water was streaming in from beyond the pines. One of the staffers was on his phone, presumably calling his supervisor. Another was trying to dig a makeshift trench away from the green to drain it. I stifled a grin. My plan was working. It wasn't a dramatic flood, but enough to cause annoyance and hopefully alarm. Maybe they'd be forced to shut down the 18th for repairs. Maybe Rick Ellison would come stomping out, realize they'd messed with the wrong homeowner. I wandered away before anyone noticed me, heading back to my truck. As I drove off, my heart pounded with equal parts triumph and fear. Because, yes, the water was going where I directed it, but now the question was, would they trace it back to me? And had I gone too far? Sure enough, the next morning, my phone rang bright and early. The caller ID read, Rick Ellison. I took a deep breath and answered. Good morning, I said, doing my best to sound casual. What the hell is going on? Rick's voice was unhinged, a far cry from his usual controlled arrogance. Our golf course is being flooded. Some new water channel just appeared overnight, and we have property damage. This is sabotage. I'll let a note of concern slip into my tone. Water channel? Flooding? Wow, that sounds serious. Did you check with city drainage? He fumed. This isn't normal drainage. It's obviously man-made. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? There was an edge to his words, an accusation he was nearly spitting out. Rick, I said calmly, I haven't had water in days, so if you think I'm out there funneling water anywhere, that's quite a stretch. Silence. He was too furious to find a good comeback. We're bringing in an engineer to investigate, he finally said. If we find evidence that you... I cut him off. That I what? Diverted a river? Rick, come on. I'm just an old guy who can't even get a proper shower. But I wish you luck resolving your water problem. I sure wish someone would resolve mine. I ended the call with a polite have a nice day and hung up. My hand shook slightly as I placed the phone on the table. It was exhilarating, but also nerve-wracking. I'd triggered them, that was for sure. As the days passed, the golf course situation escalated. Word spread throughout Magnolia Pines that the 18th hole was closed indefinitely. Staff had roped it off with neon orange mesh fencing. The ground was soggy, and the grass was turning a sickly yellow-brown from being waterlogged. HOA board members trot around in muddy boots, scowling at the mini-marsh that had formed. Residents complained about the inconvenience. Apparently, losing a hole was a travesty beyond measure for golf fanatics. But the bigger uproar came when some rumors started circulating. Maybe the HOA had deliberately shut off water to a homeowner who then retaliated by sabotaging the course. A few neighbors whispered about me, though no one had proof. Greg, my neighbor across the street, gave me a subtle thumbs up one evening, presumably suspecting my involvement. I just shrugged. However, the tension made me uneasy. Rick and the board had too much power, and if they found any hard evidence, I could be in serious legal trouble. Destruction of property, tampering with waterways, you name it. At the same time, I was fueled by the knowledge that my taps remained as dry as a desert wind. So far, the HOA hadn't budged. Their arrogance, or perhaps their desire to prove I was responsible for the sabotage, kept them from restoring my service. So I stuck to my roguish campaign. Every now and then, I visited the channel in the woods, making small adjustments, clearing debris that might divert the flow elsewhere, adding a small log to reinforce the stream's path. Bit by bit, that trickle evolved into a steady seep, enough to keep the course soaked. And the longer the flood lingered, the more money and resources they'd pour into repairs. And, ironically, the more water they'd waste trying to pump it out. One muggy afternoon, I returned from a supply run for more bottled water to see a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. Magnolia Pines HOA inspection. Access required. Failure to comply will result in further penalties. I tore it down, heart pounding. They wanted inside my house now. If they found any suspicious items, muddy boots, shovels, the maps, I'd be in hot water, if not from the tap, ironically. I quickly stashed anything incriminating in my garage and locked the overhead door. I half wondered if they'd stooped to an illegal search, but decided to remain cautious. The next day, I heard a knock around noon. I looked through the peephole. Rick Ellison, Ms. Hensley, and a uniformed county sheriff's deputy. My stomach dropped. This was serious. I opened the door, arms crossed. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone even. Rick cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe you've engaged in criminal mischief regarding the golf course flooding. The HOA is requesting a formal inspection of your property, and the sheriff is here to ensure we're within our rights, given the strong evidence and community safety concerns." The sheriff, a tall man with kind eyes, interjected. "Ma'am, sir, are you comfortable with these folks looking around?" He checked a paper in his hand, seeming to read my name incorrectly at first. "We have a court order that states the HOA can inspect for external code violations. As for a criminal investigation, that's something else entirely. I'm mostly here to keep the peace." I studied the document he held out. It was apparently some legal request for inspection, but it didn't mention the inside of the house, just the exterior. Sizing up the situation, I realized they were trying to bluff their way in, hoping they'd see something incriminating. I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me. "Fine," I said. "You can look around outside, but you're not stepping foot inside my home." Rick glowered, but Ms. Hensley gave a curt nod. They proceeded to circle my property like bloodhounds, checking garden beds, peering into my shed, sniffing around for fresh mud or evidence of my river tampering. All the while, I stood on the porch, arms folded, the sheriff lingering awkwardly at the edge of my lawn. They found nothing but a partially replaced lattice panel and a few weeds. I'd been careful. Finally, after 15 minutes, Rick marched back to me, cheeks flushed red. "We will get to the bottom of this," he seethed, "and I'm sure the city will be very interested in investigating that new water channel that suddenly appeared, especially if the flow originated on your property line. You have a good day, too," I said, forcing a neighborly smile. The sheriff gave me a conciliatory shrug and followed them back to the street. Only after they left did I allow myself a small exhale of relief. The following morning, I was awakened by the sound of gushing water. My heart lurched. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a storm, but the sky was clear. I leapt out of bed, raced to the bathroom, and twisted the faucet. Water, glorious water, poured forth. They turned it back on. An ecstatic laugh bubbled out of me. They must have realized that continuing to deny me water would look extremely bad if the county or media got involved, especially now that I was being investigated for sabotage. Perhaps they suspected restoring service would appease me or weaken my motive for revenge. But, ironically, they were a couple of days too late. My mission was already well underway. Still, the sweet relief of a shower was exhilarating. I let the hot water run over my head, washing off the grime of tension that had clung to me. Finally, I decided I'd check on the river channel later that day, just to be safe. If my taps were back, maybe I could fill in the trench. I made my point, after all. But as I arrived at the forest, I found a surprising sight. A county work crew with heavy equipment, big excavators, bright orange vests, the whole shebang. They were placing sandbags and building a small makeshift dam in the area I dug out. My heart hammered. If they found my footprints or recognized the shape of a shovel, I'd be toast. Quickly, I ducked behind a tree. I could hear them talking. "Yeah, we got a report from the golf course. The water's messing with their lower fairway. This area's been compromised. We'll shore up, divert everything back to the main channel." I stayed just long enough to see them dropping loads of rock and earth, effectively blocking my watery diversion. They worked quickly and skillfully. This was obviously a standard job for them. By the time they were done, the flow had been mostly sealed off. The water was returning to its natural course. I snuck away, tension coiled in my shoulders. My sabotage had been discovered, not necessarily pinned on me, but discovered nonetheless. The golf course would eventually recover. Maybe I got my water back, but now the HOA would be watching me like hawks. Our Cold War had escalated, and neither side emerged unscathed. Yet a crooked grin spread across my face as I drove home. I taught the HOA a lesson. There were consequences when they tried to micromanage and bully the residents who just wanted a fair shake. Sure, they might spin this to paint me as the villain. But for once, they'd been taken down a peg, forced to realize not everything was within their iron grip of control. Back at my house, I drank a tall glass of fresh, tap water, relishing every drop. I stared out at the quiet street, noticing a few neighbors peeking out at me. Maybe they suspected me. Maybe they admired me. I didn't particularly care. Let the rumors fly. I was done being a silent victim. And that was it for the most part. The HOA left me alone for the next few weeks, probably too busy overseeing repairs on the 18th hole, likely fielding complaint from the rest of the golfing crowd. They'd keep an eye on me, I was sure, but I'd fight them with every tool I had if they pulled another stunt. After all, I was now the guy who diverted a river when they shut off my water. That's the kind of reputation that might keep them on their toes. In the end, I'm not proud of stooping to their level, but sometimes you push an ordinary person too far, and they push back in extraordinary ways. And around here, water is nothing to take lightly. The end.